Hey guys, it's Timothy here, and it's finally time to go over the cards for Amonkhet and give you my opinions about where they stand. Remember that this is geared towards draft and sealed, specifically draft, so the higher the rating of a card, the more likely I am to take it earlier in a draft, assuming I'm in those colors. So just as a quick reminder, I'm going to show this in each video, that I have a rating scale that I use, and if you think the rating scale works, I'd like to know, and if you think that there needs to be some adjustment to the rating scale, then I'd love to hear comments about that. But just a quick reminder, a 10 is as high as we get. Those are just straight up bombs. 9s are also bombs, but they're the type of cards that don't stabilize very well. They're very good when you're at parity or when you're ahead at closing out the game, but if you're way far behind, they're not going to do the job for you. 8 are not quite what I consider bombs, but cards that I'd be very happy to first pick. You'll notice that 8s are very often uncommons, not quite bomb territory, but very, very solid first picks. 7s are also first picks, but not the most exciting ones. They're just usually the best common out of each color and occasionally a couple uncommons. 6s are cards that I include in my deck almost every single time. They're not cards that I'm willing to first pick very often unless I have a really bad pack, but they rarely get cut from my deck. 5 are just straight up filler cards, cards I'm not disappointed to play, but cards that you can usually get really late in the pack. And then 4s and belows are where we start getting to cards that I don't really want to play. 4 is kind of controversial because they're archetypal filler cards. They're cards that, if I had to include them in my deck, it wouldn't really be happy about it, but they fit in certain archetypes very well where their score goes up. And I'll mention, if I think a card goes up in a specific archetype and you have a deck that really works there, I'll mention that the rating will go up as well. And then 3 and below are cards that I never want in my deck under pretty much any circumstances. 3 are just weak cards in general, cards that people put in their deck and they have very little impact on the game. 2 are cards that are playable in very few situations. I don't want to say they're unplayable, even though most of the time they are, but they have a specific deck that they might work in. 1 are cards that are actually decent out of the sideboard, but are not cards you want to include in your main board. You'll notice for Amonkhet, there's a lot of cycling on cards like this, so they actually go up in value, but I'll still mention sideboard cards whenever they're relevant, and there are a few cards that I would say relegate to the sideboard only. And then if you get the 0, if you get the secret salvage or the dubious challenge award, you are just absolute garbage. And I am pretty harsh when it comes to 0s. I do not give them out very often, but you'll see here in just a second. Some 0s just deserve their spot, and they're cards that you should not be including in your deck. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and power through the rating scale in the next couple videos, and from this point forward, if you agree or disagree with any of the ratings that I've given these cards, please let me know. But keep in mind, the purpose of this is to just kind of share a ranking of the cards for people who are going to be drafting and playing sealed next week. And you're more than welcome to disagree. Just keep it classy and leave a comment below. So let's start off with our 0s, or I should say 0. There is one card that I was looking at and I just cannot see a reason to play it, and that is Protection of the Heckma. This is a 5-mana enchantment. It is an uncommon, but remember, rarity is not super important here. 5-mana enchantment that says sources your opponent's control deal 1 less damage to you. Notice there are a lot of things that this doesn't do that you would think it does. First off, it doesn't make combat change at all. It does prevent one combat damage from each creature that deals damage to you. In addition to that, you take 1 less damage from any burn spells that are pointed at your face. But this doesn't affect combat in any way. It doesn't actually reduce the power of your opponent's creatures. So anything that's in combat is still going to trade the same way it normally would, whereas normal effects like this actually reduce the amount of damage that your opponent's creatures do by either giving it -1 or preventing damage to your permanents as well. This only affects you, and it only affects damage to you. So it doesn't really affect combat. The only reason you'd want to play this is if you have almost no plan and you just want to make sure your opponent can't kill you as fast. This also isn't Kaladesh, where there are going to be a lot of 1/1 tokens floating around. In fact, there are very few 1-power creatures in this entire set, so it's not like this ever nullifies damage completely. It just reduces the amount of damage you take, which doesn't really affect the way the board plays out. It doesn't really affect the game very much. And this is a 5 mana enchantment. You're probably taking a whole turn off just to put this on the battlefield. I literally see 0 reasons I would ever want to include this in my deck, since it just does not affect the game in a meaningful way. Our ones, we only have one card I want to talk about here, and it is relevant to stop and mention the power of Cycling here, since this is the first video. Cycling makes sideboard cards main deckable. Yes, you could put Forsake the Worldly in your main deck. It's 3 mana to just exile an artifact or enchantment. It is a common, it is an instant too, which is where you want your naturalize effects, and it is significant that it exiles instead of destroys. Now, one thing to mention about this card is there are very, very few ways to deal with enchantments in this set, and there are some decent enchantments floating around. Artifacts, less so. There are a lot of value artifacts in this set, but not a lot that you'd be clamoring to destroy or exile. Now, with Cycling, you could put this in your main deck, and if your opponent just doesn't have a target for it, you could cycle it away. But this isn't Kaladesh, this isn't Aether Revolt. You do not need to be main deck in artifact and enchantment removal, specifically artifact removal. So I think we need to get out of the frame of mind that we need to have those sorts of effects available, because honestly, there are not a lot of artifacts in this set that are even worth bringing this in against. But you could main deck this card. I think it's better to just run a better card, a more useful or universally useful card in its spot, rather than a card that you intend to cycle most of the time and might have targets every now and then. But bring this in if your opponent's heavy on enchantments and artifacts. Otherwise, I do say probably keep this card in your sideboard. Cycling, again, does make your sideboard cards more main deckable, but if you have a better card to run in that slot, I would just leave this in the sideboard. Now, narrow, low-impact cards. Again, these are going to be a little controversial for some people because we haven't actually played the set, and the set was just released, but this is my opinion. The first one I wanted to mention here was Approach of the Second Sun, which I find to be a very intriguing card. This is the type of card that's either stone cold unplayable, or it might actually just be very good. My impression is that it's pretty bad, but I don't want to go ahead and say it's unplayable either. Now, you're paying 7 mana to gain 7 life, essentially, right? But you're paying that in addition to having a win condition set up for you. There aren't a lot of ways for you to be able to fetch this out of your deck. There aren't a lot of ways to get cute with it when it comes to limited, so you have to naturally draw it 7 turns later and cast it again. Now, keep in mind, you have to have gotten up to 7 mana. You have to be able to afford a full turn where you can tap out 7 mana for a sorcery that gains you a minimal amount of life for 7 mana, and then somehow you have to survive the next 7 turns despite having basically time-walked yourself, and then cast this thing again and have it resolve. So that's a lot of things going right for this to actually win the game. And if this ever gets exiled, your game plan's done, right? This is the type of card that you have to have an entire game plan around, and if your game plan falls apart, then the card just doesn't work, right? The thing is, I can actually see this winning a game. If you just wall up, and this is your this is your win condition, and your opponent's not playing a lot of counter spells, which they probably won't be, this card could just win the game when you don't really have an out to anything else. If you just have a really bad deck, but you have a lot of walled up creatures and a lot of defensive capability, then Approach of the Second Sun might be your way to win the game, and I could see this winning games, which is why I don't quite give it a 0. I do actually see this winning a game from time to time, just not very often. I think it's going to be a dud more often than it's going to be a win. The other card, I really hate this card, and I know a lot of people like it, but Sacred Cat, your 1 mana lifelinker, 1/1 with Embalm for 1. I just don't see any reason to play this card. Again, it's not unplayable. You could play a 1 mana lifelinker, but even with the extra added bonus of Embalm in this, you're just getting a bunch of speed bumps. 1 mana lifelinker, just not impressive, and then paying another mana to get that token back is just, again, not impressing me. So even though this is technically a 2-for-1, and it's pretty cheap on both sides for the Embalm and the actual card, I just don't like it. I don't see it having a very good impact on a normal game of Limited. All right, 3. These are cards that, people are going to include in their decks, but they're probably not going to change the course of the game very much. The first one is Mighty Leap. This card has been around quite often, and Mighty Leap is good in formats where it's imperative that your creatures deal combat damage. So if you think back to Magic Origins, where we had the Renown triggers, and creatures had to be able to deal combat damage to become renowned, Mighty Leap was actually decent there. But this is not that format, and there's not a lot of payoff for dealing combat damage other than just killing your opponent, right? Not a lot of triggers that you get for dealing combat damage. Mighty Leap is not a disappointing card. It's just not a card that's very exciting either. It does help you trade up in combat. It does give you flying, and every now and then it can finish off the game if you use it at the right time. But it's just a weak card normally, and it's definitely not the type of card that you want to be top decking if your opponent's way far ahead of you. Renewed Faith, this might be a little bit higher than I'm giving it credit for, but it is just a life gain card. Even if this was 3 mana or 2 mana to draw another card and gain 2 life, I wouldn't be excited about that either. In fact, cards like that often exist, cantrips that gain you life, and they're usually some of the weaker cards here. I think the thing that really gets me is that Renewed Faith is part of an uncommon cycle where the other uncommons are really, really good, and this one's just unexciting. Yes, there is power in cycling, but white is not the color that really takes advantage of discard and cycling like some of the other colors do. So I'm going to err on the side of saying that I wouldn't play Renewed Faith, and if I start seeing that it's actually really decent and the 6 life becomes relevant in a lot of games, perhaps the format is designed so that there are a lot of races instead of board stalls, then I could see wanting Renewed Faith in my deck. But as of right now, I'm not excited by it. And then finally, Gideon's Intervention. This is a weird card. It's 4 mana for an enchantment that stops your opponent from casting a certain card, and if they already have that card on the battlefield, it prevents the damage that they would deal to you or your permanents, but that doesn't seem impactful. This reminds me a lot of Captured by the Consulate from Kaladesh, which turned out to just not be that good unless it was redirecting spells, but Gideon's Intervention doesn't even have that on it. Now, I could see you bringing this card in against a card that you absolutely cannot beat under any circumstances, but with that corner case being kind of out of the way, this is not a very impactful card. Stopping your opponent from casting a specific card just gives them options to cast their other cards instead. So it might be the type of enchantment that trades 1 for 1 essentially with something, basically being a removal spell, but it's not like your opponent used mana on that card. They just get to do their other options instead. And then if you do get to resolve this after the card you name, perhaps your opponent has some ridiculous god on the battlefield or something like that, they can still use activated abilities. They can still block if they have anything that matters when they attack. They can actually still just attack with the card. All it does is prevent the damage. So I'm not a big fan of this card. I don't think it's very good, and I would be disappointed if this were my rare out of a draft pack. Alright, moving off to archetypal fillers. Again, these are cards that in the average deck are not going to be very good, but in certain kinds of decks, they'll go way up in value. The first one is Cartouche of Solidarity. If this was not a cartouche and this was just any old aura, I don't think anybody would be excited by it. It does offer a sweet little 2-for-1 for 1 mana. It creates a 1/1 warrior creature token with vigilance when it enters the battlefield, and it also gives the enchanted creature +1/+1 in first strike, which is decent for 1 white mana, but again is opening you up to that same problem with auras where it just fizzles or it just doesn't work out, or it gives your opponent a 2-for-1 if the creature gets removed. +1/+1 in first strike is not negligible either, especially in the early game. It's going to make your creature very hard to block, and you get that little soldier token left over, but that's not really worth 1 mana. Where I do like this is if you have a deck that really cares about spreading out damage with tokens, or if you have the white trial, which makes this better. That's going to be something I mentioned for a lot of the cartouches and trials, is that if you end up having both in the same color, they both go up in value, whereas they're a little bit weaker individually. Another card, Anointer Priest. I just don't think a 2-mana 1/3 is that impressive. What it does is let you gain life whenever tokens enter your side of the battlefield, and it does have Embalm. I should stop and mention that I am a lot higher on Embalm than I originally was when I saw the mechanic. I do think it gives you a lot of late game value. It gives you a lot of mana sinks to use in the late game, and it gives you the opportunity to stall the board or trade for your opponent and be on top because all of your embalmed creatures are essentially late game 2-for-1s. Now, Anointed Priest just doesn't seem that impactful for me. Remember that when you embalm the token actually enters the battlefield and gets its own trigger, and then that triggers for anything else that enters the battlefield and is a token, including all of your other embalmed creatures. But a 1/3 for 2 mana still isn't that impressive, and I don't think the life gain is going to be relevant during that many games. In Oketra's Name is a card that gets a lot better in a zombie deck than it does in a normal deck. It's 2 mana for an instant that gives all of your zombies +2/+1 and all of your other creatures +1/+1 for the turn. Now this is cheap for a buff, but +1/+1 is not a huge buff even for 2 mana and even at instant speed. And +2/+1 is decent if you're able to go really wide, but it doesn't seem like zombies are going to be able to go that wide. There are a lot of things that make 2/2 zombie tokens, but they're more expensive cards, and I highly doubt you're going to see a lot of boards with a ton of embalmed creatures on the board, just because the embalm costs are pretty expensive. Like if you just look at Anointed Priest, that's 4 mana, so you can't afford to embalm every single turn, which also means that all of your creatures are dead or in the graveyard or so on and so forth. Now, in Oketra's Name gets a lot better if you're just a full-on zombie deck, which is the black-white deck in this set. And if you have that sort of deck, I can see this being a big payoff, but otherwise in an average deck, this card's a little bit weaker. Same goes for Time to Reflect. 1 white mana to exile any creature that blocked or was blocked by a zombie creature. And obviously, if you're only running 3 zombies in your deck, this card gets a lot worse. But if you have somewhere like 8+ zombies in your deck, this is a very good removal spell. I still think it's on the weaker side simply because it is situational. There are sometimes flying creatures that are just going to be able to fly right over your zombies, and this does nothing about it unless you also have a fly-in zombie. But this is going to be good most of the times that you have a zombie-based deck. And then finally, Anointed Procession, which I erred on the side of caution here. I think this card's actually really strong, but you do have to have this type of deck to support it, which is basically an embalmed deck or a very heavy token deck. Anointed Procession basically doubles all of the tokens you get, an effect that we've seen before and is really, really strong and limited. Where I like this card is in an embalmed deck where you actually get double tokens off of embalming your creatures. It's still good if all you're doing is making 2/2 zombies, and I think you can build an entire deck around this card. So this is the type of card I'd be happy to first pick in a draft and make work, but it's not really that great in your average white deck. Even though if you look through most of the white cards, a lot of them do make tokens. So I think this card's probably closer to like a 6, but I wanted to err on the side of caution. And it is worth mentioning, if you just don't have a deck with a lot of token generation, then you don't play this card, which is why it gets relegated to the archetypal staple. Alright, moving on. This is where cards start to get good. These are cards that I would play in almost any deck. There are a lot of 5s here. Remember that this is a large set, so we are looking at a lot of cards. Aven Mind Sensor has a kind of negligible ability when it comes to limited, as far as stopping your opponent from looking through their whole library, but it's a 3 mana 2-power flyer. And Flash does give it an extra little nod. I don't think this is a very good rare to open from a pack. It's definitely not the type of card that you first pick and say, oh, well, I'm going white. But it is a solid creature that you would play even if it didn't have that search restriction. Winged Shepherd is kind of an awkward card. It's not impressive as a 6 mana 3/3 fly-in vigilance. That's just a card that's pretty easy to deal with, but still has value as a creature. Cyclone really gives it a little bit of extra value, and the Cyclone cost is cheap enough that I would include this as either an early game cantrip or a late game flyer. Impeccable Timing was a card we saw in Kaladesh, and I know a lot of people were down on it, but I thought it was perfectly playable. I think it's going to be a little bit better this time since the combat tricks aren't as potent as they were in Kaladesh. That was kind of the problem with Impeccable Timing, was if you cast this on your opponent's creature and they responded with a combat trick, most of the time their combat trick was enough to get over and around your Impeccable Timing, but we're not in that environment anymore, and I imagine Impeccable Timing will still be a solid card, granted not a premium removal spell either. Trial of Solidarity could go way up in a token-based deck. It comes down and it gives all of your creatures +2/+1 and Vigilance for the turn, which is very strong, even though you normally want these effects to be instant speed. Even doing it at sorcery speed can leave your opponent in a really tough spot. It does have the extra bonus of bounce into your hand if you have a cartouche, so if your deck has even one cartouche, possibly even two, this card goes way up in value, and you can draft a token-based deck. The more 1/1s you can make and the more zombies you can make, the better Trial of Solidarity gets. Ret Crop Spearmaster is 3 mana for a 3/1 that can exert itself when it attacks and get +1/+0 in first strike when it does. So it attacks as a 4/1. Which is very good with First Strike, which is going to be impossible to deal with during the early stages of the game. But I do think this card drops off late enough in the game that it's not as aggressive as it looks. And a 3-mana 3/1 is a creature that can die very easily. There are not a lot of ways to punish 1 toughness creatures in this set, but there are a couple, so this is the type of card that has a little bit of a downfall with its low toughness. Sparring Mummy is actually a card I like quite a bit. It's a Hill Giant, a 4-mana 3/3, and when it enters the battlefield, you can untap a creature. This is just an okay ability as is. It lets you be aggressive and also give a creature pseudo-vigilance, assuming it survived combat. But where this card is really nice and would probably push it into 6 or 7 territory is if you have a lot of exert creatures. Remember that when you exert a creature and tap it to attack, it does not normally untap during your next untap step, but Sparring Mummy lets you get around that by untapping the creature. And if an exerted creature is already untapped by the time the next turn comes around, it gets to attack again and get over that downfall of exertion. So Sparring Mummy has a home in heavy exert decks, which are Naya colored, by the way. Those Who Serve, this is just a vanilla creature, and I was about to put this much lower until I noticed that it actually costs 3 mana instead of 4. It's a 3 mana 2/4, which is very good at walling up the ground, and it has a relevant creature type, so I could see playing this in a good number of decks, even though there's nothing exciting about the card. Supply Caravan is a 5 mana 3/5 that enters the battlefield and creates a 1/1 warrior with vigilance if you control a tapped creature. Not too hard to have a tapped creature, especially if you're exerting things. That keeps your creatures down and gives you 2 opportunities to play the Supply Caravan, meaning you can play it the turn you exerted the creature, or you can play it the following turn if your creature's still tapped. And if you ever get the 1/1, I think this is a good card, and it's just good even then. I don't think this card ever goes up to like a 6 or 7, even if you are creating a 1/1, because it is just a big, dirtily dumb creature. But 5 toughness is a lot, especially in a set like this where there don't seem to be a lot of huge creatures. So this could be, again, another way to wall up while also spreading your damage out with the token. And then finally, Jeru's Resolve, which is probably a little bit better than it looks. 1 white mana to untap a creature and prevent all damage to it for the turn. You can also cycle this for 2. Again, anything that says untap a creature in this set is probably intended to work with Exert, so this works really nicely with Exert. And while this doesn't give you any sort of buff, it does guarantee that your creature will survive combat, and it does give you that little ambush factor with the untap clause. So this is the type of card that when it comes to your pre-releases and your first drafts, you want to be aware that it exists if your opponent has a white mana open. And then it also has Cyclone, which also gives it a little bit of extra playability. So I think Jeru's Resolve is probably closer to a 6, because I could see happily including it in almost any deck, although the not given a buff part is what makes me push it down to a 5. It may just be a 1 creature fog for a turn, which is how it's going to play out a good number of the times, but I think it's a solid combat trick. Alright, moving along, we're getting into cards that I'm actually excited to start playing. First is Vizier of Remedies, 1 in a green, or I'm sorry, 1 in a white for a 2/1. When 1 or more -1/-1 counters are put on a creature you control, you can put 1 less of those counters on instead. Now this is really good in white-black or white-green. Black and green are the colors that have the big creatures that come in with -1/-1 counters on them, and this does reduce the number of counters that those creatures come in, making them way above the curve. Some of those creatures are absolutely ridiculous if you can remove the counters from them. Another thing that this does is it prevents your opponent from using -1/-1 counters as a form of removal. There are some spells or some creatures that just put single -1/-1 counters on your creatures, and this absolutely prevents your opponent from doing that with single counters at a time. And then finally, it's just a 2 mana 2/1, which is a good card. I would include this in pretty much any deck. I don't think 2-drops are at a premium in this set, but 2-drops that can nullify some of your opponent's removal spells seem pretty good, and I think that's what justifies this as an uncommon. So I don't think I would ever cut this card from my deck. Gustwalker is 2 mana for a 2/2 that can exert itself when it attacks to get +1/+1 and fly in for the turn. I see a lot of people who are really crazy up on this card from the spoilers on Friday, but I think the card's a little bit weaker than it looks. Yes, it attacks as a 3/3 flyer for 2 mana, but it only does that every other turn, assuming you're not being tricksy with it. If you can untap this consistently from turn to turn, then yes, it's a really strong card. But a 2/2 flyer for 3 mana still does more damage over the course of a couple turns than a 3/3 flyer every other turn, and this creature doesn't block very well. There's a game you have to play when it comes to exerting your creatures as to whether or not you're going to be able to deal more damage than your opponent can deal back to you if you're leaving all your creatures tapped, right? So the exert deck, in air quotes there, is a very risky deck because you need to make sure your damage output is more than your opponent's, and oftentimes it will be, but keep in mind, you're locking this creature down for 2 combat phases. So this is your only creature. You may not even be able to afford to attack with it if your opponent's dealing more damage than you are. Trueheart Duelist is 1 and a white for a 2/2 that can block an additional creature each combat, and then also has Embalm for 3 mana, comes back as a 2/2 with the same ability. I like this card, first off, because the Embalm cost is really cheap. Second off, the additional creature blockage thing that comes up on creatures every now and then is both confusing when it comes to calculating combat damage and also not very relevant a good number of times, especially on a 2-mana 2/2. I don't see this effect being used very often, so to speak, but I do see this as just a card that you're very happy to trade with your opponent's X2s, your opponent's 3/2s or 2/2s, and then embalm it again later in the game or early in the game if you just need another body on board. I do like this card mostly because it's a 2-mana 2/2 that you would play anyway, and it has a very cheap embalm cost. I'm kind of ignoring the block and additional creature text, but that's not irrelevant. It does come up from time to time. Binding Mummy is 1 and a white, 2/2 zombie. Whenever another zombie enters the battlefield under your control, you may tap target artifact or creature. Now, we're not tapping a lot of artifacts in this set, but tapping down your opponent's creatures whenever you play a zombie is a huge incentive to play a very high zombie count in your deck. Keep in mind, a lot of cards that make zombie tokens make multiple zombie tokens, which triggers this guy multiple times and lets you essentially tap down your opponent's creatures, giving you free combat phases where you can get in. I like this card quite a bit. Again, just like I mentioned with Vizier of Remedies and Trueheart Duelist and Gustwalker, these are all 2-mana 2/2s, right? You'll notice a theme here with these 4 cards. These are just bears that you're happy to play and trade with early in the game and have a lot of additional value on top of that if you find that you're in the right sort of deck or you're in the right sort of board position. Unwaver and Initiate is, in an average set, I think a 3/2 Vigilance for 3 mana would just be an average card, but this does have Embalm, which means some point later in the game you're going to have open mana and nothing to do with it. You can just bring this guy back. Also, Vigilance on a creature does encourage your opponent to trade with it much more often because they're going to have to trade with it since it can just leave itself back on blocks, and then your opponent is more likely to trade when you attack with it if possible. And you want to be able to trade your embalm creatures. That's what's going to get you really far ahead in this format, is if you're trading your embalm creatures for your opponent's creatures, and then you're essentially up an extra card because of embalm in your graveyard, you can bring this back in the late game. Fanbearer, kind of a really awkward looking card, right? 1 white mana for a 1/2. You can pay 2 mana and tap it to tap a creature. This is not a fantastic tapper, but it is a tapper nonetheless. Close to Pacification Array, obviously not as versatile as Pacification Array, but these tapper type creatures are usually pretty good and limited, and I have no reason to believe that this one won't be. Even though it's kind of an expensive tap ability, it is the type of card that you can play on turn 1, and it does scale in power later in the game too. The stronger your opponent's creatures get, the better this card gets because it's now acting as a functional removal spell for your opponent's best creature at any point in the game. And it's also a zombie, which has some applications in the set, even though your tapper is not a very aggressive card and not really what you're going to be using as your insane zombie top-end card. And then finally, Devoted Cropmate, 2 and a white for a 3/2. You can exert it when it attacks, and if you do, you can return a creature with mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Now, this card could easily be very higher, or much higher, grammar. One reason that I knocked it down is that I've seen this sort of effect a lot with cards like Renegade Rallier, or there were a couple cards from Khans of Tarkir that could do this if you had attacked with a creature for the turn. And I noticed it's actually quite hard to set up the ability, but if you ever even trigger it once and you get a creature back, then the card's fine. At its base, it's a 3-mana 3/2, which is a perfectly playable card, which would be a 5. But since it does have the ability to potentially get a creature back to the battlefield, I did have to give it a nudge higher than just a vanilla 3/2, even though I don't think this ability is going to come up that often. Alright, moving into 7s. These are cards that I'm happy to see really early in the packs. In fact, these are the type of cards that once I first pick something, these are what I'm actively looking for in my second, third picks. So starting off with Tawkrop Elite. Maybe I'm overrating this card, but I'm not quite sure that I am. It's 4 mana for a 2/2 flyer, and you can exert it when it attacks to give all of your creatures +1/+1 for the turn. This is very good. This is better than something like Amonkhet's Name, which is just a one-shot +1/+1. Yes, this only activates every other turn, but that means that the Tawkrop Elite is attacking as a 3/3 flyer, which is good for 4 mana, and then gives the rest of your team a buff too, which can make combat a nightmare for your opponent, which can push all of your early game creatures through for a lot of damage early enough in the game that it gives you an edge for the rest of the game, or really puts your opponent on the back burner. And then obviously all of your exert creatures combo very nicely with the untap abilities in this set, and it's not too hard to untap this and then set it up for another attack on a following turn. Compulsory Rest is a card that it's your generic pacifism, and we've seen a lot of variations of that recently. This one is 1 and a white, so pretty cheap. The enchanted creature can't attack or block, but the enchanted creature gains the ability, pay 2 generic mana, sack the creature, gain 2 life. So this is pacifism, but it gives your opponent an out to the pacifism, right? It is functionally a removal spell. It does stop your opponent's creature from attacking or blocking, and assuming that it doesn't have any other activated abilities or any other passive abilities, it just stops that creature from being relevant. Yes, it does give your opponent the option to sacrifice it to gain a little bit of life, but it's not a lot. They're only gaining 2, and they do have to use a little bit of mana for it too. Granted, they're just going to have that mana up at some point in the game, and you're kind of giving them a little bit of a bonus, but don't be down on this card because of that. That's just an extra little clause here, and even if your opponent sacrifices it and gets a little bit of value, this still functions as a 2-mana removal spell that makes your opponent use a little bit of mana as well. So I think this card's quite strong. Definitely not first picking it in most cases, except out of a very weak pack, but I think it's probably going to be a very strong common for white. Vizier of Deferment is 2 and a white for a flash creature, a 2/2 flash creature, and when it enters the battlefield, you can exile on a creature that attacked or blocked during that turn, and then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the next end step. So there are a lot of things you can do with this. First off, you can attack with a creature and exert it, and then see if your opponent blocks or doesn't block, and get that exert bonus off of it, and then flash this in, or just cast it during your second main phase to remove that creature that you exerted, put it back on the battlefield untapped, and have it available to exert again on the next turn. You can also use this to flash in against your opponent's attackers and exile one of their attackers, essentially making it useless for the turn. And you can use this to rebuy enter the battlefield triggers. There's just a lot of flexibility in it, and while it is a 3-mana 2/2, Flash is a nice little bonus, and this does have a lot of applications. I mean, I just listed 3 off the top of my head there. Enough that I think it's actually a really strong card and something I'd be very happy to run in all of my white decks. And finally, Amonkhet's Attendant is 5 mana 3/3 flyer, which is an okay card, but has a lot of flexibility by being a cycler for 2 mana and having Embalm for the same mana cost. A lot of times you'll be incentivized to cycle this card and then embalm it later, giving yourself a 2-for-1, but even if you cast it and it dies in combat or to a removal spell, and then you embalm it later, you're still getting a 2-for-1. So there's no mode on this card where you're not getting a natural 2-for-1, and the flexibility between being a creature, a cycler, and an embalm card in the graveyard gives it a definite nod as being one of White's strongest uncommons. Alright, just a couple. We're starting to get into the final cards here for white. I thank you guys for sticking around. Let me know if you agree with these cards. The first one, strong first pick material is what I give the 8s. These are cards that if I don't have a bomb rare or I don't have an exciting rare for my first pick, these are cards that I'm hoping to see in the pack instead. Cast Out is an obvious first one. I think this card is just going to be white's best uncommon, if not tied for best uncommon. 3 and a white for a flash enchantment that exiles a non-land permanent until Cast Out leaves the battlefield, and it has cycling. In a game of limited, you are very, very rarely going to cycle this because it is just unconditional removal, not only for creatures, but any problematic permanent. And it has flash on top of that. This is just absolutely solid. As one of the best removal spells in the format, having looked over the entire format. And it is worth noting that I mentioned this at the beginning of the video with the sideboard cards. There are very, very few ways to get rid of enchantments. So once this sticks, you can probably rest assured that your opponent's not going to be able to deal with it, and they've essentially lost their card for the entire game. There are some cases where that's not going to be true, but for the most part, that's how it's going to work out. This is just a very, very good card. I'd happily first pick this out of a pack with a bad rare. And then finally, Seraph of the Suns, which is a card that I found a little bit hard to evaluate. This might actually just end up being a 7. I doubt it'll ever be higher than an 8. But an indestructible creature in limited at non-rare status is pretty interesting. Granted, yes, this thing costs 7 mana, but it's a 4/4 flyer with indestructible, which means your opponent can only exile it. You can leave this back on defense, and it basically stops your opponent from attacking, meaning that if they're not super far ahead, they're never going to trade for this creature in combat. They're just going to lose something every time they go to attack. And then once you get to the point where you've stabilized the game or you're ahead in the game, you can start attacking with this too, and rest assured that it will never die in combat either. There are a couple ways to deal with this thing, such as Cast Out and a black spell that exiles any creature. So it's not completely a washout that you're going to win the game when you cast this thing, but I do think it has relevant enough abilities that I would be happy to run this in any of my white decks. It's also worth noting that I do think this is a slower format where you can get away with casting 7 drops and potentially even 8 drops, so this isn't unrealistic, whereas in something like Kaladesh or Aether Revolt, you might just be dead before you get to the point you can cast this card, but I do like it. I think I'm going to give it the nod towards being one of the stronger uncommons and then try it out. I could see bumping it down if it turns out that 7 mana is just too much for this sort of flyer. Alright, moving on. We have 2 bombs here that I want to mention, but again, they're 9s instead of 10s because they may not stabilize against certain kinds of boards. They're also very specific to their part on the curve, and if you draw them a lot later, they get a little bit worse. But the first one I wanted to mention was Glorybound Initiate. 2 mana for a 3/1 that can exert when it attacks to get +1/+3 and lifelink is absolutely absurd if you draw this on turn 2 or 3 or 4 early enough in the game that it can attack, right? One of the problems with Exert that I've already mentioned is that you're leaving yourself vulnerable for a turn if your creatures are tapped down. Your opponent gets to swing back, and they stay tapped down, so your opponent gets to swing back again during the next turn. Glorybound Initiate really does that. Being a 4/4 lifelinker for 2 mana is absolutely insane, and it gives you enough of a life cushion with the lifelink that you can afford to take a hit back while being at parity with your opponent or pushing yourself ahead. Not to mention that there is almost nothing in this entire format that can block a 4/4 creature when it comes down to turn 3. And there are some times that your opponent straight up doesn't have a creature on turn 3, and you get to have an 8-point life swing that early in the game, which seems insane to me. This card is very, very good and just an absolute bomb when it comes to white. The other one I wanted to mention is Regal Caracal, a card that I think everybody has correctly identified is just very strong. You're paying 5 mana, you're getting a 3/3. On top of that, you're getting 2 1/1s, and then all of your other cats, including those 1/1s, get +1/+1 in lifelink. So if you evaluate this as a whole card, you're getting 7 power and 7 toughness worth of creatures for 5 mana, 4 of which has lifelink spread out across 3 bodies, and as we've seen, white decks have an incentive to spread their damage out. Not to mention there are a decent number of other cats in the set too, in white, green, and a couple colorless ones if I remember correctly. So Regal Caracal just provides a huge output of power and toughness for 5 mana, leading me to believe that it's a ridiculous bomb. The only reason I can't give this a 10 instead of a 9 is that, say your opponent just has a 4/4 on the battlefield, well, that kind of shuts down all of the cats, so you need some sort of pump to make it relevant. But Caracal does enough for its mana cost that I'm comfortable saying this is a bomb. And then finally, I don't normally do this, but I had to look at the cards and really think about them. But I think all 3 of White's Mythics deserve the Tier 1 status. And this is where I'd really like to see if people agree or disagree. The first card is Gideon of the Trials. And I'm not overhyping the ability here. I'm actually less concerned about the emblem than I am about the other abilities when it comes to limited. Say what you will about constructed. I'm not here to talk about that. Sure, you can 0 this thing. And as long as you're able to keep Gideon on the battlefield, you can't lose the game, which can be a game plan for a lot of people. We've seen a lot of white dirtily cards, camels and 2/4s and things like that. So it's pretty easy to wall up in this format and just help your Gideon survive. And on top of that, Gideon's +1 ability is really nice too, preventing all damage that would be dealt by your opponent's biggest threat, or the thing that might be able to attack Gideon. Say your opponent has a flyer and you don't, you can just plus on the flyer, and then that flyer just doesn't do anything for the rest of the game. Not the rest of the game, but the rest of the turn cycle. And then where Gideon really becomes good is the 0 ability in the middle, which is one of the abilities we rarely look at when it comes to limited, right? And one of the abilities that just gets overlooked because it's the quote-unquote Gideon ability. He becomes a 4/4 indestructible, and he costs 3 mana. And that's pretty strong. You can attack with a 4/4 indestructible. Even if Gideon dies a turn or 2 later, you can still attack him with him as a 4/4 indestructible, which is just a card that's impossible to deal with in the early game. And I don't know. I like the combination of his abilities. I don't think the emblem is super, super hype when it comes to limited, but I do think the combination of his +1 ability to nullify the biggest threat on your opponent's side of the field, and the ability to become just an indestructible, really strong, limited attacker seems pretty good combination to me. And your opponent can't ignore this. The problem with Planeswalkers, or one of the things you can do with Planeswalkers in limited is you can make the option to ignore the Planeswalker and go for your opponent, and sometimes that pans out. Even though you're giving them a lot of value by leaving their Planeswalker alone, if you can kill them before it becomes relevant, then it doesn't really matter. If you play this Gideon and you 0 him to get the emblem, your opponent has to deal with him. Otherwise, they just straight up can't win the game because that's what the emblem says. So 0ing the Gideon here is also a game plan on top of just alternated pluses and 0s of his other 2 abilities. I don't know. The card overall is just insane for 3 mana, and even in limited, even though we're not looking at the emblem as the key point here, it is a very strong option as well. Oketra is our second white mythic, and I do believe it deserves one of the top spots here. Oketra, it's going to be interesting to look at the gods and compare them all to each other, but I am trying to look at them in a vacuum, in a shell, in their own color, instead of comparing them side by side. I think overall Oketra is just a great card. So 4 mana, 3/6, double strike, indestructible. If I stop there, that would already be like an 8 or 9, right? That's just a very, very hard to deal with card. It does obviously have the downside that all the gods do, in that there's a stipulation for it to be able to attack or block, meaning that there are times where this won't be a relevant creature because you won't have fulfilled that condition. But Oketra's condition is to have at least 3 other creatures. And go look back at this entire video. There are tons of ways to make extra creatures in white. Not to mention, Oketra herself has the activated ability 4 mana to make a 1/1 Vigilant Warrior. So she helps satisfy her own condition, which is what the gods are designed to do. And you're going to be playing creatures anyway, especially if you're playing a white deck. You are going to have creatures on the battlefield. There are times that you won't have 3 or more, but it shouldn't be too hard to draft Oketra and then also have the type of deck that can support making multiple bodies at the same time. And then if you ever get stuck, you're just not drawing extra creatures. You have a nice little activated ability and a nice little mana sink on her that's just a relevant ability even if Oketra becomes irrelevant in combat. So if you ever turn Oketra on, it's a force that's really hard to deal with, indestructible, making it really, really impossible to deal with in combat. 6 toughness, making it hard to deal with minus abilities. Double strike, making it a very good attacker, essentially dealing 6 damage every time this thing gets to attack or block. And just a really cheap threat overall. I think Oketra is a bomb. well, I'm not going to compare it to Gideon. I don't actually know which one's better, but I do think these both deserve this spot. And then finally, the other white mythic I think also happens to deserve a tier 10, tier 1, 10 out of 10 spot. Angel of Sanctions is 5 mana for a 3/4 fly-in. When it enters the battlefield, you may exile a non-land permanent an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield, and then you can embalm this for 6. So we see this sort of effect a lot on creatures. Fairground Warden was the one that we most recently seen out of Kaladesh, where a creature comes in and exiles an opponent's creature, or in this case, any non-land permanent, until that creature leaves the battlefield. Now, Angel of Sanctions, if it didn't have Embalm, this would be just a 9, right? It would still be a really strong card. It's a very good flyer, and it's a flyer with a removal clause attached to it. So you're getting a 2-for-1 off of it. And I do warn people not to over-evaluate cards like this, because once your opponent deals with it, and at some point you have to imagine they're going to be able to deal with a 3/4 flyer. It's not super buff, right? They get their card back, so it kind of takes away that 2-for-1, or it feels like your opponent's getting a 2-for-1 by killing your creature. The problem is, Angel of Sanctions has Embalm, so you can just come back and do it again. And I think if Angel of Sanctions didn't have Embalm, it'd be a little bit lower, but the fact that you can just cast it again, or not cast, but essentially get the same version of the card back again is really nice too. Not to mention, if you ever discard this or you put it in your graveyard, you're essentially giving yourself access to this ability at any time. You could cast a sorcery for 6 mana, and 6 mana to temporarily remove an opponent's creature doesn't seem good, but when it becomes attached to a pretty decently sized flyer for a decent cost, I think you'll see that this card just plays out exceptionally well. It's the type of card you can't really ignore. You have to point removal at it at some point once you draw your removal, but even when you do, you know that your opponent's just going to bring the card back and do it again, and sometimes it'll even be an upgrade. They'll get to exile an even better creature the second time around. So interesting card, but I do think all of these white mythics deserve this spot as tier 1 bombs. If you disagree, let me know, but I think they fit here just nicely. And you won't often see every single mythic from a color as a tier 1 bomb. I just think it happens that white happens to just hit it out the ballpark here with 2 9s and 3 10s. Just seems insane to me. So, with that being said, I'm done stuttering through the white cards. I'll be looking at the blue cards next, and I hope you join me for that. Again, if you agree or disagree with anything, leave a comment below so we can talk about it. I know pre-release is about a week away, so if you would like to have a conversation about some of the cards, then hit me up in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe if you feel like doing that sort of thing. I'll be looking at blue cards next. My name's Timothy, and I'll see y'all next time.